también ahí, joder, tengo una aquí con...
Claro, claro, ponte.
Vale, vale, vale.
Ay, colgadme. Vale, toma, vamos a ver.
No, yo vale, voy a presentar ya. Vale, pues ya está.
O sea, entiendes, apuntas y ya está.
Sí, sí, lo voy a dejar aquí un momento.
Muchas gracias, chicos.
Chao.
Nos traía muchos.
Ok.
Let's pray. Okay. Just very slightly touch it.
Okay. Now guys, we're going to the last conference we're having today. In this case, we're going to have Harvey here. He's one of the developers of the first ATMs for Bitcoin actually. And he's working together with his son, with his brother that's there also. And now he's going to talk about like things he's working on, and also he will introduce better, I think, than me in this moment actually.
Okay, yeah. So, everyone that's left, hello. I'm Zach Harvey, and today's talk is I call Occam's Razor, From Sheep to Bitcoin, How We Must Simplify Capitalism. So start off with a quote by Ronald Reagan. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as the law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts. And so the obvious from this is that the more we add complexity to government, the more we're going to get, the less we're going to get of liberty. And so I see this as kind of the importance of presenting fundamentals first. And so focusing on what really matters first and not getting bogged down in very complex systems. And so in today's world, whether it's public or private, though usually in many big private corporations, at least incentivized in one way or another by government programs, there is a tendency to have these huge, grandiose solutions to problems that might have much simpler solutions. And so one example you can take from that is today's financial system, a hugely complex system with many different moving parts that after years and years always seems to fail in brand new ways, versus a very simple original use of money and monetary systems, and how we can solve that in perhaps a simple way that doesn't introduce all this complexity. But we also see this in systems of agriculture and medicine, and so we're going to touch just a few of those today. And so for me, the solution, of course, is when possible, reduce the complexity and have a little humility of understanding that there's a lot about the world that we don't yet understand, and always trying to engineer new solutions that we haven't thought of isn't necessarily the right way. And of course, patience of, even if something is going bad with a simple system, that doesn't immediately mean we need a more complex solution. It just means that we maybe need some more time to see what happens. And so I called the theme of my talk Occam's Razor, but it's of course based on Occam's Razor, which is a philosophical idea that when presented with competing theories, prefer the one that is simpler and not the complex one. And so I think that applies to a lot in markets as well. When you see too much complexity, maybe it's time to step back and see why that complexity exists, what it is, and if maybe there's a better, simpler solution that would provide better benefit to markets. And so we can start. This is my first AI-generated photo of the day, as you may notice, with the sheep's head and the forged fingers. And what this represents is the very beginning of trade, I think that I put down here, maybe not the very beginning, but this, I believe the query was 12th century Spanish herders trading. And so what we have is a very simple and direct transaction here of two people that know each other and that are trading things that they're both very familiar with. And so what we get here, do I put this on me or just leave it here?
It's already on, yeah, it's already on.
But do I? Okay.
No, here, there is fine, yeah.
Okay, cool. And so in this transaction, I see it as what I would call the low noise transaction. So in every transaction, there are signals, there are market signals that we're saying, I want something, you want something, let's work together, and if we reach that consensus, then we know we're both satisfied. And so the concept of, say, a broken telephone is a fun kids game that I'm sure you're familiar with. Or you say something to a friend, and then he says it to another friend, and then a third friend, and you see what comes out on the other side. And so we're very familiar with this concept in communication of when you introduce middlemen, it introduces noise to the message, right? But people don't think about that as much when it comes to commerce and trade with the idea of the broken telephone, of what happens when we introduce middlemen. What happens when we introduce more noise? Is it as much as are we really getting what we intended from this transaction, or are we introducing rumors to the transaction or economic gossip and things that maybe aren't as helpful to what we want long term? And if we're making dozens or thousands of these decisions every day or every week, then how is that going to add up in the end? And so one of those things, for example, is money itself. So with the fiat currency we have today, with all the inflation, we are giving our money to someone in order for something that we want, but it's very hard for us to track the actual value of that money because it's changing all the time. And then would we treat that same transaction in the same way if instead of inflationary, if the currency was deflationary, right? Like if you want to go and buy yourself a new car, for example, well, if the value of your money is going down, then it's a good time to buy a car because your money's not going to be worth that car in a few days or weeks or year. But if your money is deflationary, then you might say, you know what, the car I have right now is good enough, I'd rather save this for a better time. And so that also goes into to part of the market signal. And so when you have a flawed currency to begin with, that kind of introduces noise to every single transaction we do. And so it's very important. Another way of seeing market signals is information channels. Every time we buy something, it's communication, and we are trying to transfer the information of what we want and how we live our lives. But if there's a problem with that channel that has holes in it, then over time, we're not going to get all the value that we can get from it, and we're not going to have a system that's as complete as it could be. And that's what I mean by the compounding noise, which is basically you have noise built on top of noise of noise and noise. And in the end, we live in a world where we think we're making these decisions, but there's a lot of stuff happening in the background that we're not even aware of. And so another part of this is what I call regulatory rot. And that's basically when you have a system that starts off as perhaps more free market, but then it gets into this cycle of regulatory issues that just keep on adding and compounding as regulatory issues. And so you can take, for example, banks that were more free market back in the past. Then they're like, well, the government comes and says, well, we identified a market failure here somewhere, so let's introduce some regulation, right? So you have this state interference. And then you, of course, have unintended consequences from that regulation. And so the state goes and says, well, we've tried regulating you, you're still misbehaving, so I'm going to have to correct this new misbehavior by you with more interference. And then it gets to the spot where you have fewer and fewer players in the market, and that's when you get the regulatory capture, that the regulation is so difficult that only a few players can actually play the game. And then, of course, that is blamed on the market again and start over and over again until you get more and more government control of markets. And so you definitely see that in banks, but you also see it in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, you see that in agricultural businesses, and many more. And so one example of that is housing, for example. And so another way of thinking of this is you have, in every transaction, you can have a low noise transaction, meaning one that's very direct, where you say, know the person you're transacting with, you know what they're selling, where it came from, you have all the information about it, they have all the information of what you're giving them, and it's totally consensual, right? And then you could have a high noise transaction where you're getting something, but you don't know exactly what you're paying and you don't know exactly what you're getting. And then of course you can have anything in the middle. And so housing, I would say, is probably somewhere in the middle. You could go to a house that you want to rent or buy, you can see the house, you can decide if you like it or not, and you can decide that the price is more or less what you're willing to now pay for the price, but maybe the price should be 1/10 of what you're paying, right? Maybe in a real free market, it would be way, way lower, and you just have to accept the current market that it's in right now and make your new calculations. And so there's a famous quote about housing by the Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck. In many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. And so what rent control, obviously what it does is you have the state comes and says, we think landlords are being too greedy, we're setting a price that now has to be a price. As far as informational channels or market signals, that's just smashing it completely and saying, we're ignoring this for now. And so what's going to happen, there are going to be a few lucky people that are able to get a non-market price for the houses, and everybody else now has even less supply that they have to fight over, and then they're going to have to pay even more. Plus, even the lucky people, their landlords won't want to put anything into their apartments because they're not making any money, they're probably losing money from it. So for them, it's a disaster and they won't want to renovate or do anything, so you get crumbling houses. Another example is cars these days. And so I just saw this article a few days ago with electric cars, that you're supposed to save. One of the, the big benefits of electric vehicles, besides the fact of the subsidies, is that you don't have to pay for gas. But then it turns out that people are paying as much as they would pay on gas on insurance now because of the batteries. And so that's pretty much an unintended consequence that people didn't see coming, and now they're like, what's going on? That's another example of a higher noise transaction. And so in the case of the cars, if this were just a free market thing, what would you do? You'd say, well, I want a car, I want it to have this and this performance. I know gas is the price of the market, I'm just going to go and buy it and make my decision. But the cars themselves have very high taxes on them. Electric cars have lower taxes. So that's the first decision you make that's not market-based. Then there are high fuel prices, another stage where it's not market-based. And then you have all these incentives for hybrids, and honestly, like plug-in hybrids are some of the weirdest cars on the market now, because you have to put fuel into them and recharge them, and so you can't fast recharge like full electric vehicles. If you drive it on the highway, you're not going to make any use of the electric vehicle part. And so it's just like this weird combination that you would never see in a proper free market, but added this need for, we need a car that hits the subsidies. It's basically a car that was built for the subsidies, or the tax breaks, whatever you want to call it. And then same thing, of course, for EVs, but then what's going to happen with the batteries. So it's just another example, and farming is yet another example. And so you think, you go into the supermarket these days and you're buying meat, but do you really know exactly what you're buying? Do you know what went into growing them? Do you know what subsidies went into that, or what subsidies went into the wheat? And so it's very hard to know just by going to a supermarket what determines the meat prices or the wheat prices or the eat prices, eventually the food. It's all just kind of a big mess. And the opposite of a simple free market system. And so what actually influences our choices? Well, the information that we have. But if that information is highly influenced and distorted, then we're not going to be able to make really good decisions in the end. We're just going to basically react to what exists right now. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the history of sheep now, but it's really the history of money. And so sheep, what you just saw right there, was not AI, it's a real animal. It's the wild mouflon, which was the grandfather of all domesticated sheep that we have today, which is one of the first animals for us to domesticate. And so this kind of marks the beginning of the Neolithic period of agriculture, where before that we weren't really trading so much, and when we were, then it was really kind of within this village. But we all know what happened with agriculture. The second we became stable and we started producing things and then could produce them more efficiently, then we could start specialization, right? And so this was a huge part of our modern history of how we went from being hunter-gatherers to the humans in the society that we live today, and sheep are a big part of that. And before that, we had tribal trade. And so the interesting thing about tribal trade, it was pre-money. And so before money, we just didn't have money. We didn't even have bartering. We just had social debt, in a sense. You can call it that, but it's really just community. So people had their goodwill, they had their reputation. One way you could think of it is that one guy had really good sheep meat, the other guy had really good sheep cheese, and they just give it to each other and they trade and they know what's going on. Everything's in their minds. They know everybody, so there are no trust issues. They don't need a currency. And so if you ask me, that's one of the reasons that even today we feel a little bit uncomfortable about asking people close to us that we trust to pay for things or to take money, is because we see money as something that you need more in situations when you don't have trust than situations where you do. And so the first currency really started when we traded beyond our tribe. When we introduced, when we started actually trading with strangers instead of killing them. And the first stage we had of that was bartering. And so the good thing about bartering is it's immediate. It's right then and there. You don't have to save it for later. I have something you want. You have something that we want. There's no trust that's really required as long as we know what we're getting. We do the trade, and then that's it. We're gone. Of course, the problem with that is the double coincidence of wants. What happens if I don't like sheep cheese, and that's all you have? Then I'd have to figure out some complex way of like, okay, you tell your friend that you owe him this cheese and this and this and that. It just wouldn't work. So the way we do that is we save the value of that trade for later, and one of the earliest ways of doing that was with cowrie shells. And so they look something like that. They're seashells, early Chinese currency about the 16th century BC. And what's interesting about this is it was really the beginning of real trade. So people could actually use this. It was the first real, it was the first instance of real currency that we see of people trading things for things. And trade was really growing in that period. In fact, trade grew so much they ran out of shells. And so it's what we today would call the liquidity crisis. And so what did they do? They started making them out of bronze. Now, I guess you can all imagine what the problem with that is. And so at a much later stage, they started minting coins. And so these were some of the first minted coins. They're called Lydian coins, and they're made from electrum. And electrum is a natural mix of gold and silver. And this was first minted about 650 BC in what is modern-day Turkey. And of course, what happens when we mint coins? Somebody's going to debase them. And in fact, so this is one of the first at least historically noted dilutions of currency. You had the Roman denarius from 200 BC that was 95% to 98% pure silver, and 400 years later, it got down to 5% silver purity. Now, of course, that sounds really bad, but it's nothing compared to what's happening with even the US dollar these days, and I think in the past 100 years is probably about 1% of what it was worth. And then we can get a little bit into the history of banks now that we've talked about money, and we'll get back to money in a bit. The first kind of something you could really call a bank was 2000 BC. It was a Babylonian grain bank. So it wasn't with currency, it was with grains. And so they would just store it, and they would even loan it, which is very interesting, of course, of a way of having bank before currencies. The Medici banks, I'm sure you've heard of, and they may have been the first ones to really have a serious banking system, so of course they introduced fractional reserve banking. Now, it's not the same kind of fractional reserve banking we have today that's well regulated, but they owned the banks and they decided what they did. And so what they did was basically loaned out more than they had, right? Very profitable business. 1609, Bank of Amsterdam. It was the first time we really had like bank money, IOU notes, and foreign exchange. Bank of North America funded the Revolutionary War. Of course, banks throughout history have always been funding wars. The Medicis funded it. Bank of North America. Of course, if you watch Game of Thrones, the Iron Bank as well. 1913, Federal Reserve, central bank. And so they said, you know, we don't want all these other different banks. Each one of them is making their own dollars. We don't like this idea. Let's take it all into us. Fast forward to 1970, and there's the Bank Secrecy Act, which for me is, there aren't that many people that talk about this as one of the, part of the history of banks perhaps, but to me it's one of the big ones. This is when they introduced anti-money laundering laws and basically ended bank privacy, but they also basically ended the ability of banks to be private. And so ever since this time, you've seen fewer and fewer banks in the US, and the ones that still operate have a tremendous amount of regulation, and they're basically just extended arms of the government at this point. Now, 1 year later, fiat currency was introduced. What is fiat currency? It's basically a government just saying, well, this is worth it because trust us. And so since 1971, the dollar is off the gold standard and is backed only by the full faith and credit of the US government. If you want to read a little bit more, there's WTFhappened1971.com. And so this is what the dollars looked like back then. 1928 dollar. I don't know if you can read that, so I made it a little bit bigger. What is that saying? Redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. So you could just take your $5 bill back then, go into a bank, and get its equivalent in gold, right? Fast forward, modern times, 2006. What does that little blue circle say? This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. In other words, trust us. And what happened to the money? That's what happened. This is 1970, and this is today. And so the monetary base grew by many, many, many times. Last time I showed this slide was before the inflation, so it was at the peak. Now they've actually started retracting a bit. But this is basically the theory that they're operating with now, is modern monetary theory, which is it's not bad that we're printing a lot of money. It's good. We should print more money. We should print more, and we should spend more, and we should tax more. Now, the first question that comes to mind is like, why do I even need to tax money if I can just print it all the time? Like, what's the point? I can just keep, and the reason is they tax it to make the economy grow slower. And if you smash the economy, then inflation goes down. And they somehow think that that is a good thing. Like, that's how you solve inflation, is by making everybody poorer, and then there's a kind of a natural deflationary effect. And of course, Bitcoin that fixes this. Bitcoin has a very important role in understanding the flaws of this system. And for me, this is the great simplification. You take a system that was getting more and more and more and more complex, that added in more and more and more noise, and then you take a system that's just so simple and brilliant and introduce it to the world, and is basically like the nuclear bomb of finance. So first of all, you fix the inflation problem by having fixed supply. You can't just make it up. It's not fiat currency. It's direct, so you don't have any middlemen involved. So you have no noise that's introduced by a middleman. It's permissionless, so it's private, and nobody can stop you from sending it. So you don't have the anti-money laundering law issues. And energy as well. It's based on proof of work and secured by energy. And what's important about energy is progress. And so if you want a system that is future-proof, it basically has to be based on energy. And otherwise, the energy will kind of just power through it. And so having a system that's actually secured by energy, which is turned into computational energy, is part of what makes Bitcoin so robust. Now, the other interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it's not just an improvement of fiat or the banks. It's not a continuation of that. It's basically going back to the cowrie shells and let's digitize this. This worked well on a very fundamental basis. This is the right idea of a currency. we don't have to introduce complexity. We just have to go back to that point in time where it was still simple and digitize it and do it in a way that we can use it in today's world. And now I want to talk a little bit about the history of energy because I think it's super important. And as I said, to me, energy is a big part of progress, even starting from fire. So before we were even Homo sapiens, about 1 or 2 million years ago, when primates figured fire out, they could start using it for cooking, heating, protection, of course lighting as well. But what did that mean for humans? Well, what it meant is by cooking, they could now externalize part of their digestive system, right? By heating, they didn't need to have as much fur. And by protection, they didn't have to be as strong and robust. And it would also, of course, allow them to move to the next stage. Since they could drop all of their, anything that's unnecessary from their anatomy, they could put all of that energy that they get from eating lots of mammoth, of course, and cooking it outside, and that just goes straight to the brain. And then that starts a process. If we get smarter, we need more energy, we find out how to get that energy for us from the animals, and we just keep on growing to the point where we became far more intelligent than any of the other beings on Earth. And then about 8,000 BC, that's the beginning, as we spoke, it's the Neolithic period, we introduced animal power. So we were able to harness the power of animals for plowing, for example, with ox, transport with horses, and all of a sudden this gave us this amazing ability to produce more food and reach farther. Think of further. What that means for trade. You have more opportunities for trade, for transport, and you have more opportunities for markets. You're producing more. And so that was a huge, huge step. Then you have the water wheel that you can use for grain grinding instead of doing it by hand. Windmills, grain mills, now we can pump more water. Think of what that means for agriculture. Then coal later on, eventually only used for heating, but that still was a lot more efficient. And then we just pop over to the 18th century with steam engines, and that, of course, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that changes everything. Energy is at the source of all of our progress, and it's probably the most accurate way of looking at human progress, is energy. And so if you move forward with energy, you will see more progress, and if you retract that energy, you're going to see regression. Electricity made it available for everybody in their household to use energy all day long. Oil, the combustion engine, flight, we of course know what oil's done for us. And then nuclear power, the ability to create almost endless amounts of energy at a very low cost. And this is something, it's abundant, it's also a lot cleaner than the other options. It doesn't pollute as much. And so getting nuclear to a bigger chunk of the world would mean more progress for the world. Now, I didn't put renewable energy in there because I don't think they necessarily represent progress. They're not more concentrated forms of energy. But I also don't like them for other reasons. So for one, you have the wind turbines that are known to kill lots of rare birds in nature. There have been reports of probing for them that have beached dozens, if not hundreds of whales in California. And then they use this weird way of calculating both for solar panels as well as wind turbines. They use something called levelized cost of energy, which is basically you assume what will the energy be if these work all of the time in a constant manner. Where a big problem of these things is that they don't, right? So wind turbines work if there's wind. If not, you have to use something else. And the same thing with solar panels. Solar panels work if you have sufficient sun. If not, you need another source of that energy. If you destroy all your other sources of energy, you're going to have to import it from a country or burn coal of some sort. And last one is I also think they're ugly. And so if we look at, this is a tweet that I've seen just a few days ago. Europe's petrochemical industry is heading for death row. And so it's at the lowest levels since 1975 of naphtha, of crude oil. And this shows that there's something really wrong with the way Europe is currently looking at energy. And what it's basically doing is moving into regression. And so that's something that's very important to pay attention to. And so is the solution to just stop oil? It's a meme that I enjoyed. Well, here's the problem with that. You can optimize for reduction of CO2, but it's important to remember that CO2 is just a marker. It's one marker. It doesn't mean that because we have CO2, all of Earth is going to be doomed. It means there's something we have to pay attention to. If you optimize for that, then you're ignoring all the other things that impact the planet, and anything from weather systems to temperatures, and I'm going to go over that in a bit. It's, of course, being anti-cow. I'm all for animals. I think they're terrific. I think that there's something to industrial farming, but that applies to animals and plants in the same manner. Fuel taxes just end up making people poorer. And there are also the dams they use for hydropower dams. They're definitely not good for the environment. And the last part of it is it doesn't really address the core climate issues. Now let me just go into a quick history of the plow. So this, as you can see, is very similar to the energy history. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. But it started with sticks as hoes. Bronze Age, we moved on to harnessing it on animals. And as we progress and get to the steam tractors and the combustion tractors, we all of a sudden move from plowing small parts of land and earth to tremendous areas. And the problem with that is that tilling the land isn't necessarily even good. We started doing it in the agricultural revolution because it releases nutrients. And so it makes it easy to grow things. But that's not necessarily what the planet wants or the way the planet is designed. And so we have what I call microeconomics, which is basically you have the mycorrhizal network of you have fungus, under subterranean fungus, and it acts as a network between all the plants. So it connects to roots of trees and roots of plants. It connects to biology, and it creates this basically a free market of trading what it gets from the trees and the plants, which is the photosynthesis, turns them into sugars, and the fungus is like, sure, I'll take this sugar, I'll trade it for water, carbon, nutrients, nitrogen, all right? And so you have this way of all of the trees can kind of communicate with each other and the plants through this fungal network, and it works very well, and it makes sure that the soil always has what it needs, that all the different parts have what they need. When you rip that up with tilling, you're destroying the connection. You're destroying the network. You're not going to get the same amount of information, which is a lot when we were talking about market signals, exact same thing. It's the market signals, it's the information channels, and they're being disrupted when you till. Now, if you're tilling with a few sticks or with the plow in a small area, it's not going to have as big an impact on the earth. But when you start introducing huge swaths of land and combustion tractors to this, and industrial farming, it's a very different picture. And so part of the way I see modern farming today is soil socialism, is what I call it. What you're basically doing is you're taking this top-down fertilizer, external to the network, and you're saying, this is what I'm giving you, this is what you have, right? It's free, guys, take it. What do? It's basically welfare for them. They take it, but then they don't work as hard. And so we see that actually happening, and that causes soil erosion. And that's why in a lot of farms today, you'll see a lot of, anywhere you see where nothing's growing and you just have dust and soil, it is because we have over-tilled and added too much fertilizer. And so basically what we want to do if we want to restore a system is we have to stop tilling and rebuild it up. Now, of course, it's not so simple with the systems we have today, but just to show you how bad it is. I'm going to skip over this one. The Dust Bowl. Have you guys heard about the Dust Bowl in the U.S.? Basically, in the U.S., this is what it looked like. For about a whole decade, you had a problem where there were you had agricultural areas in the U.S. across the Great Plains that had no rain. and all of the soil basically turned into dust, and you had these huge sandstorms. And what started off as a very lush area where people came to farm, within a very short period of time, basically turned into a desert. And here are some of the things that caused that. There was this Homestead Act of the earliest 20th century, which basically said, we're going to give you, the United States government is going to give you a certain amount of land if you go and farm there. People were like, okay, we'll take this land and farm there. And then they said, even more so, we're going to give you a federal loan act. We're going to give you loans for buying up farms and buying all the equipment you need. And then there's this big race to modernize expensive equipment. So it was the very beginning of tractors. People started buying this very expensive equipment. And what did they do? They took these vast areas of lands, they just started plowing, and plowing again, and plowing again. And then their inputs started becoming more expensive, right? And then, so they paid more for that. And then they're still paying off their loans. And then what happens? Drought hits, and they're totally screwed. They're totally screwed because they can't pay anything. They're not getting any money for their crops anymore. And they basically, it may have been one of the triggers for the Great Depression, but if not so, anybody in that area was totally screwed, and most of them just left the area as it was. But it was completely destroyed. It took them a very long time to start building it back. And then 1933, they had the Agriculture Adjustment Act, which was to try to correct this. And part of what it introduced were a lot of these subsidies we have on foods today, of like corn, and what do you do with land, and that sort of thing. So it was a huge disaster. And you can kind of see what happens when we take something that started off as good, agriculture led to civilization, but without realizing what happens when you apply that heavy force to it, that it can actually do a lot of damage. And if you ask me, that's one of the main reasons that we see a lot of weird weather patterns today is because of industrial farming. We're cutting down tons of trees, planting monocrops. There's not enough diversity. There are not enough natural systems, and that just disrupts everything. But we see something similar with public health as well. And so first of all, as you know, there's no such thing as free healthcare. In the end, we all pay with it with our taxes or with inflation. It incentivizes a lot of overuse. There are people that go to see a doctor for all kinds of different reasons. In the case of a lot of older people, it's because it's somebody to talk to. But it's also probably, if people are hypochondriacs, for example, or they just enjoy going to doctors, or they have issues that they don't really have, but it incentivizes that because there's no real pricing mechanism. Another problem is their overprescription and overtesting. You are not actually the customer of your doctor, right? The doctor gets paid regardless. They get paid from the government. However, they do sometimes get benefits from the pharmaceutical companies. It's not always a direct check. Sometimes it's fancy dinners, sending you to conferences abroad, that sort of thing. Overprescription is a problem everywhere. I'll go into just a few examples in a second, as well as over-testing. So one of the things that fascinated me to hear about just a short period ago was that a colonoscopy, which is a test that you do to see if you have colon cancer. It's usually around, when you're in your late 40s or early 50s, they tell everyone to do it. But then they did an all-cause mortality research to see if it actually, doing this test, actually helps you live longer, because we know that if you catch the cancer in time, then you help yourself out. And it turns out there isn't any benefit to doing it. And the reason for that, can't know for sure, but one hypothesis is that there are a lot of cases where people don't have cancer, and they treat them like they do have cancer and have invasive surgery, and that shortens their lifespan. There are also cases of the colonoscopy itself actually doing a little bit of harm. But we can't know all of the reasons. All we know is that if you actually look at all-cause mortality, and not just the benefit of that exact cancer, there's no real benefit. Yet everybody's doing it. A tremendous amount of money, it's stress, and this is the kind of things you see when you get into the guidelines of the public health that just become solidified.
Sorry, one thing. We need to be moving now for the booking we have later. We need to be
Okay, so I should just end?
Yeah, better. It will be better, yeah.
Okay, thanks guys.
I don't know if someone needs to ask something or need to say something more also.
I'll just basically, the bottom line is Bitcoin is a terrific example of a situation where you can, where you find a really simple solution to a very complex situation, and that exists. So the question is, can we find the Bitcoin of agriculture? Can we find the Bitcoin of health? Can we find the Bitcoin of education, of housing, and of energy as well? Can we approach these things in a way where we take systems that are grossly complex and a tremendous amount of market noise in them and reduce that noise so that we can live in a world that is truly what we want and that benefits us? Thank you.
Thank you so much.